Good afternoon. So welcome to today's event. My name is Caroline Rochelo. I am the Director of Research and the Curator of Ancient Collection, not Asian collections. We don't have any at the museum. And it also happens that I am the curator for the Samurai, the Making of a Warrior exhibition. So thank you so much for joining us today. Before I introduce the speaker, I would like to remind everyone, please silence your cell phones. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's two speakers. Dr. Morgan Pitelka is the Bernard L. Herman Distinguished Professor at UNC Chapel Hill, where he is affiliated with the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, History, and Archaeology. He teaches and researches the history of medieval and early modern Japan, focusing on the visual and material culture, the tea ceremony, the samurai, and more recently, cities and their environment. His newest book is a study of a Japanese city that was destroyed in Japan's Age of Warring State, titled Reading Medieval Ruins, Urban Life and Destruction in 16th Century Japan. Dr. Matthew Hayes is a librarian for Japanese Studies and Asian American Studies at Duke University, where he manages both collections and provides research and teaching support for faculty and students. He is the co-editor for the online essay series, Collecting Religion, which highlights scholarship surrounding personal collections of religious ephemera. His research on the interplay between lay and monastic ritual communities in early modern Shingon Buddhism has appeared in the Journal of Religion in Japan, the Journal of Asian Humanities at Kyushu University, and most recently in Arts. Matthew's forthcoming article on approaches to Shingon preaching in the turn of the 20th century, which engages one of his books on display here at the museum in the exhibition, will appear in the Journal of Japanese Religious Studies in 2025. What was not mentioned in these short bios is that both Dr. Pitelka and Hayes are two of the three consultants on the scholarly team for Samurai, the Making of a Warrior, because I said ancient collections, not Asian. I am not a specialist in this. So I surrounded myself with people who knew a whole lot more about Japan than I did. So not only did they guide me as I developed the project, but also wrote panels and labels for the exhibition. Those of you who have already visited the exhibition will notice that the making of a warrior is not just about a man, his armor, and his sword. It includes art, culture, and religion, and a discussion about women in samurai families, and thus offers a much more nuanced view of Japan's iconic warriors. Today's two-part lecture, Samurai as Patrons, Governance, Martial Arts, and Zen Buddhism in the 17th century Japan, focuses on this aspect of the samurai seldom, if ever, mentioned in exhibitions of arms and armor. But in the first half, Dr. Pitelka will talk about samurai war and cultural patronage, while in the second, Dr. Hayes will discuss Zen patronage and the warrior mind, and we'll have a seamless transition between the two, and there will be a question period at the end of the second half of the talk. So please join me in welcoming our speakers to the floor.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Caroline, for the warm introduction and for working with me to put this amazing exhibition together. I played a very small role, but I felt very lucky to get to be involved. I'm going to be talking to you today about cultural patronage, which obviously is at the heart of any consideration of how beautiful arms and armor, but also art objects come to live in a museum, right? How do these amazing artifacts survive to the present? But I want to try to connect that to war, not only because some of the artifacts that we'll be looking at and that you've seen in the exhibition are swords and suits of armor, but because cultural patronage and warfare are linked in interesting and surprising ways in pre-modern Japan. And that's a linkage that I'm really interested in as a historian. It's one of the main things that I study. So the history of the samurai goes back to really the 10th century. But the first time that we see samurai rulers actually in control of an institution, running a government essentially, is in the first military government, the Kamakura shogunate, that was established in the late 12th century. And the reason the samurai were given permission to establish a government by the imperial court, you know that Japan has an emperor even today, and that imperial line goes all the way back into the misty, dawn of Japanese history. The court allowed the samurai to form a government because the samurai had successfully defended the court in a war called the Genpei War, and essentially won the right to subsume some of the functions of government from the imperial court in exchange for their ongoing protection, at least in theory. And so this new warrior government was located in eastern Japan in a city called Kamakura, and it was a new experiment in Japanese history. Never before had there been a government other than the imperial court that in this case did not replace the emperor, but ruled essentially alongside the emperor. You can think of the existence of the shogunate and the imperial court as being similar in some ways to the existence in medieval Europe of kingdoms and the Vatican, right? Where they have different spheres of influence, different realms of power. Sometimes they collaborate, sometimes they come into conflict, but to a certain extent they coexist. So the early rulers of this Kamakura shogunate were descended from imperial families, and they had deep cultural connections to the imperial court, but they also wanted to distinguish themselves from the imperial court. They wanted to make a mark as a new kind of ruler. And so their government was located in eastern Japan, far away from Kyoto, where the imperial court was located. And the city of Kamakura, in the early medieval period, was famous as a city of Buddhist temples, because the Kamakura shogunate invested very heavily in the patronage of Buddhist institutions. Again, similar in some ways to the devotion of monarchs in medieval Europe to the construction of churches and cathedrals as a sign of your religious devotion, but also as an expression of wealth and of power. And one of the schools of Buddhism that really thrived under the patronage of the Kamakura shogunate was Zen Buddhism. Zen is the meditation school of Buddhism. This is a school of Buddhism that originated in China, where it was called Chan Buddhism, and came to Japan around this time and became increasingly influential among many different Japanese, but it really resonated for many samurai. In Zen Buddhism, your focus is on the mastery of the body, the disciplining of the self through the practice of sitting meditation, zazen. And this devotion to stillness and to sort of conquering the quirks of the body felt familiar, I think, to many samurai who were, of course, existentially required to be in control of their bodies so they could fight successfully on the battlefield. Now, unfortunately for us, the city of Kamakura was destroyed, both in wars and through natural disasters in different moments in Japanese history. And very little of that early Kamakura period remains. But what does remain is this famous outdoor Daibutsu, this great Buddha, that is a wonderful, I think, marker and expression of the Kamakura shogunate's commitment to Buddhism and patronage of Buddhist institutions for religious reasons, for devotional reasons. In many cases, individual samurai families were committed to particular Buddhist temples for the worship of their ancestors, but also, as in the case of medieval Europe, as an expression of power, as a sign of the wealth that the shogunate accrued and its ability to invest in culture that was appealing and impressive to all. So from the very beginning of warrior rule in Japan, there was this devotion to culture. The second warrior government in Japanese history relocated to Kyoto. And this second shogunate is called the Ashikaga shogunate for the family that ruled it, the Ashikaga family. And the shogun in that regime, who is the most famous and most successful leader, not only in his period, but perhaps in the entire medieval period, is the man you see on the screen, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who really thrived in every realm that he turned his hand to. He was a brilliant commander. The wars that he fought, he won. He was a leader of men. He was able to unify the diverse warlords under his command who otherwise might have come into conflict with one another. There was a big political crisis during the period of his rule that I won't go into detail about now, but he solved it. He brought these two divided branches of the imperial family together. In the realm of trade, he successfully essentially signed a trading agreement with China so that Japan could trade with the Ming Dynasty and the treasures of China could flow into Japan and indeed to the collection of the Ashikaga shoguns. So he was one of the most impressive rulers of his age. And we see that very clearly in his commitment to the arts and his cultural patronage. And sometimes this regime is referred to as the Muromachi shogunate, and that is because the primary palace from which the Ashikaga shoguns ruled in Kyoto was located on Muromachi Dori, Muromachi Street in the city of Kyoto, which you can still visit today. And this palace was a center of politics, but also a center for theatrical productions, for poetry salons, for banquets, for all kinds of social and cultural rituals that the Ashikaga shoguns patronized to maintain their rule. I'll return later to the question of why the samurai were so interested in these cultural practices, because in a way that's the key question I'm trying to wrestle with in my talk today. But I think this painting does a wonderful job of showing how there are all these different structures that have indoor and outdoor areas. So you can have processions of warriors, you can have tea gatherings back in these hidden corners, you can have big banquets in the central residence, you can bring samurai together to kind of maintain the samurai organization in the palace in Kyoto, which is a vital part of the functioning samurai society. The building that Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, this successful shogun, commissioned, that is perhaps the most famous building in Japan even today, is known as the Golden Pavilion, or Kinkakuji. And this was built as a kind of retreat for the shogun in his retirement in northwestern Kyoto. And it was originally a series of buildings, a kind of temple complex that was both a residence and a site of ritual activity for the Ashikaga shoguns, and especially for Yoshimitsu. This is a very unusual building because it's covered on the upper two levels in gold foil. Each level gestures to a different architectural tradition in East Asian history. It's a really magnificent structure, and even today is one of the most popular tourist destinations in Japan. But this itself represents, to some degree, the clearest sign of the deep devotion of the Ashikaga shoguns to cultural patronage as a part of politics, not as a separate lane of activity. That's kind of the basic point I want to make again and again today. Jumping forward a little bit in time, another very famous Ashikaga shogun was Yoshimasa, whose portrait you see on the screen. He was a noted patron of the arts as well, but was famous for being one of the most disastrous political leaders of the entire medieval age. Japan fell into a state of civil war after his rule, and it was his fault. He was far more interested in the tea ceremony, poetry competitions, hosting banquets, bringing various monks and cultural practitioners together in his palaces than he was in adjudicating disputes between warrior families. When you don't adjudicate disputes between warrior families, they kill each other, and you have civil war on the streets of Kyoto, which is what happened under his reign. So it's interesting, the scholar of Japan, Donald Keene, referred to the culture that developed in Japan when Yoshimasa was shogun as the soul of Japan. I'm not sure a nation can have a soul, but be that as it may, he really respected the cultural accomplishments of Yoshimasa. And I think that makes it all the more striking that he was so unsuccessful as a political and military ruler. He wanted to imitate his ancestor Yoshimitsu and construct a beautiful villa on the outskirts of Kyoto that he could use in his retirement. And so he commissioned the construction of what's called the Silver Pavilion, or Ginkakuji, in the northeastern hills of Kyoto, a beautiful structure that actually survives in its basically original form to this day, surrounded by elaborate water, sand, gardens of various types. And like the Golden Pavilion that Yoshimitsu constructed, was used for social and cultural rituals and was central to Yoshimasa's cultural activities. And if he had been more politically involved, would have been where his political activities would have occurred. But what I want to emphasize is that these structures, the Ashikaga commitment to building these lavish palaces that they used for both cultural and political activities, had an enormous impact in Japanese history on the fundamental space in which social interactions took place traditionally. So here, for example, are some features from these Ashikaga palaces that you still can see in traditional structures in Japanese architecture. Here on the left, we have what are called staggered shelves, which are these sort of asymmetrically arranged built-in shelves that were used by the Ashikaga shoguns to display imported Chinese art, Chinese ceramics, Chinese metalwork. And these were prized possessions. Sometimes they would be given names. They would have a whole genealogy of ownership that was part of their identity. And as a result of the Ashikaga warrior leaders acquiring and displaying these Chinese treasures, the practice of collecting art and displaying art became a core value of elite samurai. They modeled the collecting of art, and this kind of diffused out through samurai society over the course of the second half of the medieval period. This space here on the right is in some ways even more important. This is called the tokonoma, or the decorative alcove. It's a very distinctive Japanese architectural feature because it uses these subtle spatial and architectural clues to demarcate an otherwise very plain space, a sort of tatami mat covered shelf that's just up one level from another elevated level, which is up one level from the floor, as special, right? It semiotically signifies the thing that is here matters, right? This is where something beautiful, something meaningful will be displayed. It's a bit like the way if you walk into someone's house and there's a metal stand with an object on it covered in glass, you know, well, that must be important, right? That's something valuable, something artistic, something interesting and important, right? In the museological culture of the world we live in, that's how you denote that significance. The tokonoma does that in Ashikaga period Japan, and it does it for the humblest of objects. For a flower arrangement, which signifies the season. Usually you'll pick flowers or branches from a tree that are in season at that moment in the place where you live. And a hanging scroll, which is often a piece of Chinese painting or Chinese calligraphy that the Ashikaga shoguns collected and passed down. Eventually they were spread throughout Japan, collected by warrior leaders during the period of civil war. But these basic structures became core to samurai practices of cultural exchange and sociability as ways to display visual and material culture that mattered to them, that showed off their wealth, but also that showed off their connections. You could use the objects on display to communicate non-verbally with guests at a tea ceremony, at a poetry salon, at a banquet. You could celebrate someone's achievements on the battlefield by putting a hanging scroll connected to them and their family and never say a word, but that warrior would understand that you were honoring them. So it becomes a whole rubric for maintaining warrior society and healing the wounds that occurred naturally, both literally and metaphorically, in the course of battle. So one of the arts that comes out of this Ashikaga culture of collecting and display is chanoyu, or the tea ceremony. And many consider chanoyu to be among the most kind of quintessentially traditionally Japanese cultural practices. In chanoyu, you collect objects, you collect utensils, visual and material culture, some of which might come from China or Korea, but increasingly over time, most of which would have been domestically produced in Japan. You use those objects, you don't just display them, you use them to prepare tea. So here, for example, we see a natsume, a lacquered tea container. We see a chashaku, a tea scoop carved out of bamboo. And we see a chawan, or a tea bowl. And although we can't really see it because this is so artfully photographed, there's a tea whisk, a chasen here, that's being used to mix the matcha, the powdered green tea, in the tea bowl. We also see a water container with a lacquered lid and a chatsubo, a tea leaf storage jar. And all of these utensils that are collected by tea practitioners were highly valued by samurai during the medieval period under the influence of the Ashikaga shoguns. So tea today in Japan is mostly associated with non-samurai practitioners, because in later periods, merchants and artisans became devoted practitioners of tea. But the most committed original practitioners of the tea ceremony in Japan were warriors. And they got into it in the period of civil war when, in a sense, on a regular basis, they were going out into battle. Their society was being shredded, pulled apart as men were wounded, men died, men came back with PTSD. And practices like the tea ceremony, I think, allowed samurai society to mend itself, to reform, for new hierarchies to be formed, new bonds to be created, new alliances to be cemented. So I don't think the samurai would have been as successful as warriors if they hadn't also been such devoted cultural patrons. Another art form that is absolutely dependent on samurai for patronage and that emerged under Ashikaga shogunal rule is the No theater. No is usually spelled in English N-O-H, as you can see here on the left. And the No theater is a highly sort of abstract, symbolic, dramatic art. It reminds some people of traditional Greek theater. There are masks that are used. Musicians are on stage. There's a chorus. The actors themselves also sing and chant. But the themes of the No theater are those of loss, of death, of nostalgia for an age of peace. And many of the characters in the No theater are ghosts, who are those who were wronged, those who were unfairly defeated in battle. The No theater, I think, is a kind of repository of the memories of the samurai who have fought in battles generation after generation, lost your friends, lost your father, lost your sons, women who've lost their husbands and their children to war. The No theater, which often, the plays of which often revolve around this epic piece of Japanese literature called The Tales of the Heike, which is all about the Great Genpei War that launched the samurai into Japanese history, this whole theatrical form, to me, represents a kind of mourning of the samurai class for all of the wrongs that they have committed and all of the suffering that they have endured. And this became one of the great theatrical traditions of pre-modern Japan. In the medieval period, it was patronized mostly by the shoguns, as I said, but over time, it diffused throughout society. It continued to be most popular among samurai patrons in the later Tokugawa period, but eventually in Japan today, it's something that all fans of theater love. There's no particular connection to that samurai identity anymore. And it's one of the ways in which the kind of imprint of samurai patronage became so fundamental to Japanese culture itself that you couldn't separate them. You couldn't pull them apart. And it's another one of the reasons that the great scholar Donald Keene referred to the culture that emerged under the Ashikaga as the soul of Japan, because it includes art forms like no. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about war, because I'm trying to make the argument that culture and war were interdependent, and that the ability of the samurai to survive and to thrive when they were constantly killing each other and losing their loved ones depended on cultural production, cultural patronage, and social rituals of various kinds. But I haven't really talked about the warfare part of it very much yet. So this is a suit of armor that is from the Ashikaga period. It was once owned, it's believed, by the founder of the second warrior government, Ashikaga Takauji. And it's a beautiful piece of armor that would have been entirely suitable to riding on horseback and shooting bow and arrow while you guide your horse with your legs, which was one of the most fundamental ways that the samurai engaged in battle. They were skilled cavalry, riders and fighters. And although we associate samurai today with swords, it is probably the bow and arrow that seems to have been the most important weapon of the samurai historically. Lower level foot soldiers, you give pikes, you give cheap samurai blade or cheap bladed weapons to, and they rush out and die under the onslaught of the enemy cavalry. But the most skilled samurai would have tried to fight primarily from horseback and only dismount if really forced to do so. So most of the different styles of armor, there are some exceptions, but most of the different styles of armor from Japan, I think, really emphasize mobility and the need to be able to move your torso while your lower half stays sturdy and still, guiding and controlling the horse. Now, swords, however, are inescapably the most romanticized and mythologized weapon of the samurai, and for good reason. The variety of swords that were produced in pre-modern Japan are astounding in their craftsmanship, their artistry. The blades are complex, folded multiple times out of different types of metal to produce blades that were both strong, but also could be sharpened to a truly deadly level. Swords came in various shapes and sizes. There are these huge long swords that one person could barely pick up. And then there are medium and smaller length swords that you would use actively in battle. Swords sometimes were used for very gruesome purposes. One of the traditions of the samurai on the battlefield that I don't think gets talked about enough is headhunting. The samurai would ritually remove the heads of the enemies they defeated, particularly equal ranking or high ranking enemies, and tie them to their belts and carry them with them until the battle was done, so that they could prove who they had defeated by showing their head. And this is a form of trophy taking that is found in many cultures of war around the world. And in Japan, you would actually have what I call a performance review ceremony, a kubi jikken, a head examination, where each high-ranking warrior would show the heads of the enemies he defeated and would be rewarded accordingly. So you're really getting paid for your labor here. Heads were cut off using swords. And we never see discussion of this in museum exhibitions because it's gross, I get it. But this is one of the functions of these tools, right? So they're not just beautiful art objects. They have an aesthetic dimension that we should celebrate, but they performed a grisly function as well. And that's a reminder that the samurai were not only patrons of the arts, they also were very deadly and very violent warriors. Swords were also used as gifts. So I've talked a lot about the ceremonies that were held in these palaces. One of the ceremonies that samurai often engaged in, that we see in the documentary record in particular, the documents I read from this period, are gift exchange ceremonies where two high-ranking samurai meet. Maybe they want to forge an alliance, maybe they want to settle some kind of dispute. And the way they begin is they exchange cups of sake and they give each other gifts. Sometimes they do this all night long. So they're exchanging dozens of rounds of sake and exchanging unbelievably valuable gifts, one after another, after another, after another. Here is this 13th century sword that has been passed down in my family for generations. Here is this horse that I rode into battle last week. Here are 100 gold pieces. Here is this Chinese painting, right? And then you're drinking the whole time. So very obviously, ceremonies that are intended to build up a group that is constantly being torn down through warfare and through battle. Swords were very valuable as gifts, but they also, as we see in the exhibition, but also here in these images, are often displayed because of their beauty, because of their history, because of their value. And indeed, it's on that note that I want to conclude. So I've mentioned the Kamakura shogunate, that first warrior government that was based in the eastern city of Kamakura, known mostly for its patronage of Buddhism. The second warrior government moved back to Kyoto, was much more invested in the arts, maybe created the soul of Japan, if such a thing could be said to exist, but certainly helped to start the traditions of the tea ceremony, the No theater, and many other cultural practices. The third warrior government is the Tokugawa shogunate. If any of you have seen the recently very popular miniseries Shogun, that is, of course, a fictionalized version of the story of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the real-life warrior who founded the third and final warrior government in Japanese history, the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603. It's sort of, the miniseries is telling the background story to that establishment. And what's remarkable about the Tokugawa shogunate is that it ruled from 1603 to 1868 in relative peace. The threat of violence hung over the residents of Japan because they were ruled by warriors who had swords on them at all times. And we just learned what warriors do with swords, right? But it often is called the Pax Tokugawa, the age of Tokugawa peace. And it was a success for the Tokugawa, but it also created a dilemma. What do the samurai do in a society that doesn't need them to wage war? How do they live? What is their reason for being? Many became bureaucrats. They worked in government. Some became bean counters, much better at figuring out a ledger of who had paid their fair share of the taxes than at cutting someone's head off. But they had a kind of identity crisis because of their inability to wage war and practice the martial arts that defined their identity. So the display of armor, the display of swords, the performative side of samurai culture became increasingly important over the course of the Tokugawa period. And that, of course, is the last age of warrior rule before Japan modernizes. So in a sense, the version of samurai culture that modern Japan inherited was not the battle-hardened samurai world of medieval Japan. It was this peaceful, sort of gentlemanly Tokugawa samurai culture, where showing off your wonderful suits of armor was as central to your identity as a samurai as your ability to fight on the battlefield. And I think that's part of why we are lucky to have inherited so many great works of arms and armor, as well as the various cultural products of their patronage in the world of museums today. So we're going to hear more about the Tokugawa period, and in particular about the relationship perhaps between religion and martial arts in an age of peace from my colleague, Dr. Hayes. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to your question.
I just want to say thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you, Morgan, for a wonderful overview. I seem to learn something new every time we interact, and today is no exception. A perfect segue, I think, for me, and I'd like to build on Morgan's very excellent coverage of warrior patronage over several centuries and pick up on some of his points on the social function of patronage, and in my case, focus on religious patronage. The items on display in the subsection on Buddhism here provide a material sense of how samurai engaged religion, and as I think is clear in much of the didactic literature throughout the exhibit, we can see how religion, along with many other forms of personal and cultural expression, were wholly integrated into the lives and worldviews of samurai, and indeed early modern Japanese people generally. One of the many successes, and I say many, one of the many successes of this exhibit, I think, is its attention to the varied lives of samurai, which include cultural and artistic and religious activities that extended well beyond the battlefield. There we go. All right, I'd like to spend some time today building on that concept of integration from two perspectives, and in so doing, answer, hopefully, at least these three questions. First, I'd like to pull back and explore the broader social integration of Buddhism during the early modern era. And I think it will become clear how Buddhism was not only part and parcel to the lives of early modern Japanese people, but was in fact interwoven with a range of governmental, economic, and institutional systems that pervaded society. Second, I'll provide one example of a rather well-known Zen Buddhist named Takawan Soho, who instructed and wrote about the relationship between Zen and combat. And I'll focus on one or two key Zen concepts that help illustrate Takawan's perspective on that relationship. This image here that you see to your left is depicting Takawan, and it's taken from an 18th century illustrated hero narrative titled Moritsugumatsu, and it encapsulates much of what I hope to communicate today. What is this Zen priest doing in a warrior epic? Just as we see Takawan positioned visually and narratively alongside literary warrior figures more than a century after his death, the same was true of his life. Takawan saw no distinction between Zen principles applied in Zen practice versus those applied in any other activity, whether cooking or cleaning or combat. Much like the items on display here at the museum, we find in Takawan a clear and personal vision of how Buddhism shaped a samurai's conception of martial prowess, the role of the mind and body, and even killing. Taken together, what I hope to communicate today is that in line with much of what you've seen or hopefully will see in the exhibit, religion was one among many cultural touchpoints that gave shape to the warrior ethos. One advisory here before I begin to answer these three questions. It's important to mention that there were also several religious touchpoints, and that Zen was in fact not the only influence on the early modern Japanese worldview. The worship of localized deities, or kami, referred to contemporarily as Shinto, was also a deep influence and shaped the views of the natural world and its relation to the human world, the formation of early social units that persisted well into the 20th century as a kind of national essence, or kokukai, and the apotheosis of political and martial leaders across time. Shinto and Buddhism have shared in a very complex relationship since roughly the 6th century and have endured during periods of intense syncretism, absolute disunion, and just about everything in between. So while not the focus today, I'd just like you to simply know that relationship kind of remains in the background here, and that Buddhism really only comprised a cross-section of the samurai's worldview.
Can you talk slower and
Yes.
more and louder?
Sure. Yeah, maybe, does this help a little bit? Okay, perfect, thank you. It's also worth noting that when it comes to Buddhism, Zen was not the only influence. Pure Land Buddhism, a tradition focused on the salvational aid of the Buddha Amida, as well as the Shingon tradition, focused on immediacy of awakening through speech and bodily-based practices, also provided their own mental frameworks for Buddhist followers. Historically, Buddhism has addressed ultimate concerns at this individual level, but also at the collective level. It has provided answers to eschatological concerns over world decline, ritual concerns over the protection of the emperor, and political concerns over the prosperity of the Japanese nation. So my focus today is really only on a small portion of a much wider and I think diverse repertoire of religious activity. But as I mentioned, I think find in Zen the most observable link between religion and the warrior ethos. All right. I'd like to contextualize the role of Zen in Japan's 17th century. And to do this, I'd first like to give an example of Buddhism's social integration during this period generally. I think one marquee example is the legally bound administration of Buddhist temple patronage and a host of related activities, which cut across all strata of society. And this was called the Danka Seido, or the Danka system. The Danka system was the formalization and codification of pre-existing forms of affiliation between a household and a temple. Under this system, all Japanese households were legally required to affiliate with a local temple of any sect. This affiliation took several forms, and perhaps most notably, required affiliates to commit to yearly memorial services and, when necessary, funerary services to be rendered by the affiliate's temple. Beginning roughly 40 years ago, and led largely by Japanese scholar Tamamuro Fumio, scholars of Japanese Buddhist history have focused on the monopoly over these specific activities, especially that enjoyed by the Zen school. The Zen dominance with regard to rendering funerary and memorial services, which often included the granting and sometimes buying of posthumous ordination names, which ensured a meritorious rebirth for the deceased, was so encompassing that scholars tended to refer to Buddhism during this period, and I think perhaps a bit reductively, as funerary Buddhism, and to Zen as funerary Zen. Zen, however, was not the only Buddhist school that rendered these services, and if you judge, I think, by the map here on your left and the chart on your right, you can imagine the type of very diverse, localized affiliations and economies that emerged through these ongoing transactions of ritual services. Fees for these individual services were required, in addition to yearly fees that were handed over to the temple to fund temple upkeep. In many cases, affiliates were required to come to the temple and physically contribute to temple maintenance. Buddhist clerics were required by the shogunate to administer over their affiliates, which meant keeping and maintaining records of births, marriages, deaths, changes of residency, and other details among them, as well as administrate local temple schools, and especially at larger temple complexes, serve as spokespeople for governmental announcements of edicts and new laws that would affect their affiliates. The result of this network of temple affiliation, which stretched into all domains ruled over by the shogunate, became an obligatory patronage system, which opted in all early modern Japanese. The Danka system was formalized against the backdrop of a new closed country policy, which would endure for more than 250 years, itself a partial outgrowth of deep-seated suspicions surrounding the Christian faith in Japan. This suspicion did not take form overnight, but was rather the result of a string of incidents during which Tokugawa Ieyasu discovered several Christian daimyo among his retainers and a broader conspiracy led by an individual named Arima Harunobu to retake lands from the shogunate that had been seized during the Sengoku era. This prompted suspicions against Harunobu of treason, of threats to kill proxies of the shogun, and more generally of an infiltrating Christianity that threatened the very existence of Japan. Even in the face of new trade relationships with the Spanish and with the Dutch, the shogunal regime saw all foreign presence as a potential threat. And as scholar Namlin Her has shown, this threat was articulated not only as material, but political and spiritual. In a letter here, declaring the promise of foreign trade as irreconcilable with the threat of Christianity, Ieyasu laid out the framework for the subsequent closed country policy, citing Japanese religion as a model of fealty and national protection. I think this is a very profound statement, and I think it serves us well in thinking about how religion and rule and patronage were intimately linked during the early modern era. Both the Buddha and Kami received the direct patronage from Japan's leaders and subjects, and in return support the unification of the nation. And perhaps more crucially, actually participate in the very relationships between lords and vassals. These relationships between lord and vassal, ruler and subject, ruler and Buddha, ruler and Kami, were premised on both religious fidelity and personal trust, and in some cases, on very real power dynamics. In fact, the Danka system only reinforced the power dynamics between Buddhist clergy and lay people that had been in place since the arrival of Japan, and endowed the clergy with proxy administrative reach on behalf of the government. In some cases, as in this documented incident between an affiliate and a priest from Chosenji, the coercive power of priests was exercised in rather devious ways. Instances of coercion and outright extortion were not uncommon, and I think, if anything, attestations like this alert us to a very marked change in the administrative power of the clergy over its temple affiliates. Whereas power was vested in the clergy by the imperial court and power distinctions established institutionally and on the premise of voluntary patronage in previous centuries, the new power vested in the clergy by the shogunate by way of this Danka system allowed for these power distinctions to take shape more readily at the individual level. Christians remained in Japan following the implementation of the Danka system, and there existed certain mechanisms within this system that worked to expose the perceived threat from within the country. The infamous practice of using fumie, or stepping on picture, sometimes you see this rendered as efumi, or picture to be stepped on, is one example of this. So in cases of suspected Christians, or those who were profiled as such for doing things like evading taxes or resisting obligatory temple services, they were made to trample on an image of Jesus or Mary or the cross in front of village and temple heads. Doing so without hesitation would be a measure of one's fidelity to Buddhism and more generally to Japan and its ruler. Scrutiny like this, which took many forms beyond the fumie ceremony, was socially impactful. Christians went into hiding and formed underground networks. Neighbors suspected one another, families turned on one another, village heads turned in their own villagers. Documents like this one on your right here, I think, demonstrate a kind of overly cautious administrative duty among some village heads who went out of their way to ensure that the absence of Christians in their villages was very well documented, even, as in this case, swearing to travel personally to the magistrate to clarify any issues or errors found in the registers provided by him. So while the power dynamics were certainly at play between lords and vassals and between temple priests and their affiliates in prior centuries, the Danka system sharpened and heightened these dynamics during the early modern period. The shogunate's premise for its enactment, fears of religious enemies from within the country, as well as the possibility of unchecked power among decentralized temples, signaled a new view of the role of religion in early modern society and its social order. I'll give one brief historical example that demonstrates just how socially symbolic and powerful Buddhism had become during the early modern era, especially during the 17th century. In 1627, there occurred an event known as the Purple Robe Incident, which laid bare shogunal concerns over any challenge to its power. Challenges, again, from not only the local lords, but also from the imperial household and the Buddhist clergy. In the 17th century, the shogunate issued a series of directives to major temples, introducing new regulations that limited the power of temples and the authority of the imperial house in administering over those temples. One of these directives stripped the imperial household of its power to confer purple monks' robes to select abbots, which was essentially a kind of imperial title, exclusive clerical rank, and a status symbol conferred to monks on the basis of great spiritual achievement over a career. This directive was ignored by the imperial house for years and years until the shogunate stepped in 1627, stripped 154 imperially conferred monks of their status, of their titles, of their robes, and banished many of them. This moment is regarded as a real watershed shift in religious authority and administrative power from the imperial household to the shogunal government. So along with the coercion by priests at the local level, as we saw, and the administering of tests like the fumie ceremony to publicly prove one's religious and national fidelity, here too, I think the overtaking of robe conferral by the shogunate tells us just how wieldy religion had become for the Tokugawa social order. Personally, communally, and administratively, the shogunate exercised its power through new forms of Buddhist patronage. All right, I'm going to pivot here just a bit. Before turning to Takuan Soho, I'd like to say a few things about Zen and its basic doctrinal and practical frameworks, which I think will help us to better understand Takuan's point of view. Japanese Zen is a tradition that was transmitted from China, as we just heard. They're called Chan, which itself purports to have been delivered by the Buddha himself. And I use purport here very deliberately because unlike other Buddhist traditions that primarily authenticate their history and tradition through canonical texts that emerged in the centuries following the Buddha's death, themselves said to have captured the very words of the Buddha, in the case of Zen Buddhism, it authenticates itself through a story about the Buddha, the earliest text of which only dates to about 1060 and is only extant in Chinese. The locus classicus of the story is contained in a larger compilation called in Japanese the Mumonkan, or Gateless Gate, or Gateless Barrier, No Gate Gate. You see these sort of permutations. This is essentially a collection of koans or paradoxical cases or kind of puzzles. If you've all heard like what's the sound of one hand clapping, this is a kind of derivation of a type of a koan. And they were textual precedents that captured awakened activity or enlightened activity among recognized Zen masters in the past. But these were also used as objects of study in the present, meant to elicit this same awakening in dialogical exchanges between a student and a master. This foundational story, I think, helps to communicate some of the key attributes of Zen and is going to be helpful here. I provided an image, a sort of late 19th century image of this very story. So according to the story, the Buddha stood before his immediate disciples and prepared to deliver a sermon. Rather than speaking, the Buddha sort of held up a flower and just twirled it gently between his fingers. And all but one of his disciples sort of stood there stunned and sort of unable to understand the Buddha's meaning of this gesture, if there was one. One disciple named Mahakashapa, who I think is here, smiled at this gesture, and that's it. Just sort of sat there and smiled. This was understood to be the wordless transmission, a sort of mind-to-mind transmission of wisdom. and a demonstration of Mahakashyapa's direct apprehension of the Buddha's teachings in total, in whole, and of his matured wisdom achieved in that very moment, right there in front of the Buddha. The aspects represented in this story, things like wordlessness, ineffability, the sort of direct apprehension of reality or experience, and the intuitive nature of wisdom, pervades so much of Zen doctrine and philosophy and practice. Zen enlightenment is premised on the sudden or immediate realization of the practitioner during this current lifetime. So in this case, or in this framework, enlightenment is not a distant possibility to be achieved over eons and eons of rebirths and rebirths. According to Zen Buddhists and in East Asian Buddhism more generally, we are in fact already Buddhas. And in order to realize this innate Buddhahood, we must see the world as a Buddha does, free of defiled thinking, free of an over-reliance on artificial distinctions between oneself and the external world, and from a place that transcends words and language and calculation and discursive thinking. So the moment of awakening is the Zen practitioner as they are, empty of any process of discernment, and in fact identical to any awakened Buddha. This is referred to in Japanese Buddhist text as yose, or thusness, or isness. Sometimes you see as it isness, probably to your frustration. The mind forms the basis of this kind of ontological framework precisely because it is the mind upon which we premise our entire experience of the world outside. In East Asian Buddhism, this absolute centrality of the mind is often referred to as Isshin, which refers not simply to one mind in the kind of numerical sense, 1, 2, 3, but rather more abstractly to a oneness or a non-duality or an identicality of the mind of the practitioner on the one hand and the mind of the Buddha on the other. They are one and the same in the Zen framework. And practice is really a means to realizing and affirming that non-duality in that very moment. So we can see this phrase actually captured just in the few sentences within the Lotus Sutra woodblock currently held here within the exhibit. I think this is the side that's exposed to viewers. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it is. So even here in other sutra literature across East Asia, we see this term deployed fairly regularly. This non-duality, or this oneness, extends well beyond the practitioner and the Buddha binary and into each and every categorical duality that governs our lives. Things like likes and dislikes, things like comfort, discomfort, suffering and contentment, on and on and on. At the risk of adding to an already deeply narrativized image of Zen, some aspects of Zen practice have historically been described as antinomian, insofar as they shirk any and all dualities of human convention, calculation, logic, and even ethics. After all, these two are simply ideas that rely on our own deluded faculties to parse the world. So you find, for example, phrases attributed to Zen masters like, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. Others are said to have spit on images of the Buddha. Others still are enshrined in the Mumonkan, the text that I mentioned earlier, as demonstrating their awakening to their masters by screaming uncontrollably, or cutting cats in half, or walking around with their shoes on their head. These activities, from the Zen view, are awakened activities, or enlightened activities, insofar as they demonstrate a complete detachment from our imposed dualities. Again, things like ethical, unethical, proper, improper, decorous, indecorous, so on and so forth. So the Zen tradition tells us that these monks are at once Buddhas in our world through this radical non-attachment and are held up as key spiritual achievers. I'll say more on this seemingly transgressive, radical action in just a moment. You probably have questions. Okay. Takuan Soho was, in fact, one of those very 154 monks who had had their robes and statuses stripped by the shogunate during the Purple Robe incident. Takuan and the other exiles were eventually pardoned and invited back to Edo by Tokugawa Iemitsu, who also rescinded the edicts governing purple robe conferral. And so with this kind of renewed status and new notoriety as favored by the shogun, Takuan wrote extensively on the role of Zen in martial strata of society. He wrote in a very simple and direct style and composed many of his works, especially his poetic works, in kana, which is the Japanese syllabary, for a kind of wider readership. And his principal works are even cited by Western authors on similar topics, such as the 1948 work, Zen in the Art of Archery, by German philosopher Eugene Herigo. So in the remaining time here, I'd like to focus on one additional and related Zen concept drawn from letters written by Takuan and addressed to well-known swordsmen of his time. And I think that showcases his understanding of the Zen mind and how it relates to swordsmanship. All right, so I'll begin here by again referring you back to my earlier mention of Ishin, or the foundational mind of awakening. This is a mind that is kind of supple or nimble and unhindered by discernment or distinction and overthinking and overcalculation. I'll ask you to recall also Mahakashyapa's smile, just this sort of single gesture at the Buddha holding up a flower. And this is a gesture that arose spontaneously and naturally, and again, kind of unconnected to any calculation or overthinking at the sight of this flower. For Takuan, the mind of a swordsman of great prowess is the same, insofar as it ought to maneuver freely and unguided by purpose or aim. A swordsman ought to take the widest view of the world before him, which is one free of any fixed concentration or reliance on overcalculation. Takuan explains this through several examples, such as this one, which I think might remind some of us of the well-known idiom, missing the forest for the trees. Takuan uses metaphors like this fairly often throughout his writings. He'll describe the fixed mind like a cart on wheels, which might remind us of our one-track mind. It's sort of a similar idea. It's bidirectional, right? Only forward and backward, and therefore kind of limited in its range and mobility. Conversely, he describes the unfixed mind like a gourd bobbing freely in the water. So if you push it underneath, you submerge it and let it go, it's going to come up as it pleases, right? Sort of according to whatever microcurrents are happening within the river or what have you. So a mind focused on a single aspect, for Takuan, is a mind hung up or stalled, and therefore, in the Zen sense, unable to simply be as it is, or nyose. And in the martial sense, as we'll see in a moment, a risk to one's life. So this mind as it is referred to by Takuan and in Zen more broadly as mushin, or no mind. We should note, however, that this does not mean a deliberate shutting down of the mind or an active refusal or apprehension whatsoever. And this is because actively shutting down the mind or these modes of apprehension are still yet mechanisms of the mind itself, right? So anyone who has attempted meditation in their life has probably understood this in the early stages, especially sort of actively forcing the mind to be empty or actively forcing the mind to meditate only invites further thoughts and frustration, typically, at least in my experience. So no mind, for Takuan, is a mind that works like the hinge of a door, swinging freely by whatever force drives it, and yet all the while uncaring about who or what is entering or exiting. He illustrates this point in one of his works titled Ketsujoshu, or Knotted Cords. And here he encourages a kind of indifference to thought, but also, and this is quite crucial, an indifference to no thought. It abides nowhere, loose and flexible, able to allow the free passage of thought, and crucially, avoid any attachment to it. In the context of combat, such mental attachment can be deadly. Any hesitation, any mental dwelling on your attacker or their weapon is enough to risk one's life. Just as the Zen tradition encourages radical non-attachment from our physical, mental, and emotional dualities that govern our biases, so too does Takawan encourage such non-attachment from these same dualities in combat: self and enemy, self and sword, enemy and sword, so on. As he advises here, it is the stopping of the mind or the fixing of it upon any one object or outcome or moment or possibility or impossibility that heightens the risk of defeat. I also note here that Takawan is not simply advising against a mind stopping only on the external phenomena, the external world outside of the warrior, but also the weapon and body of the warrior themselves. I think we see this most clearly in this formulation, which is taken from the same work. You can see this sort of patterned delivery here. This happens quite a lot in his writing, not a kind of a poetry necessarily, but this sort of repetition over and over is very, very typical of his writing. Put another way, just as Mahakashyapa demonstrated his spiritual attainment by smiling spontaneously at the Buddha's flower, so too does the master swordsman demonstrate his prowess by maneuvering spontaneously and freely through the battlefield. To react as a Buddha before one's master, much like Mahakashyapa did, is to react with no mind and therefore demonstrate one's spiritual achievement. Likewise, to react as a Buddha before one's enemy is to react with no mind and therefore demonstrate a kind of transcendent martial ability. This final line, which I've underlined here for you, I think sort of strikes at the core of some of what's going on in his thought. So in battle, the mind ought to abide in nothing and yet be open to everything. This is what he ultimately means by mushi, or no mind. All right. As I begin to conclude, I'm sure many of you are asking this question, or hopefully are asking this question. After all, the first precept of Buddhism is to not take the life of any living thing. We have to recognize this. There's a scholar named Brian Victoria, Zen Victoria, who has argued that Takawan was one among several early modern monks who kind of redefined the ethical boundaries of Zen Buddhism, and by these means laid the textual and ideological foundation for pre-war imperialist thinking that would emerge roughly 3 centuries later. Victoria claims that Takawan and others fathered a kind of soldier Zen, but struggles, in my opinion, to show direct connections between Takawan's early modern thinking and the nationalist thinking that emerged during the pre-war period. And yet, nevertheless, and modern readings aside, we have to confront what appears to be an encouragement of a very grave transgression in the Buddhist tradition. While Takawan does not advocate for killing unnecessarily, he does ascribe to that same non-duality that I described earlier with regard to antinomian acts, here presented in a work called Annals of the Sword Taya. Killing for Takawan, while it should never be done needlessly or indiscriminately, is philosophically akin to many of the seemingly antinomian acts that are justified in the Zen framework as transcendent of any human ethic. That is, if donning sandals on one's head is an embodied transcendence of social artifice, if spitting on images of the Buddha is an embodied transcendence of religious dogmatism, if cutting a cat in half is an embodied transcendence of categories of human ethics, and if all of these acts are held up as expressions of a Buddhist non-duality, then Takawan's perspective on killing human beings actually falls right in line with these examples. If the samurai operates from a place utterly free of any distinction, then there is no distinction between transgression and virtue, between right and wrong, which I think maybe is best captured by this top citation here. And on the bottom here, Takawan tells us that the work of killing should be carried out without any distinction between self and enemy, killer and victim. Of course, one wonders how much of this perspective was put into action during a time when the samurai class was relegated to largely bureaucratic and peacekeeping roles within society, as we just heard from Dr. Pitelka. While there were indeed small skirmishes and instances of revenge killing, we should not accept Takawan's images of a samurai sort of single-handedly dispatching 10 men as the early modern norm. Despite this reality, though, of a samurai, or excuse me, despite this reality that combat and killing had largely become a historical and narrative symbol of the early modern samurai class, the philosophical moves that Takawan makes in his writings to reconcile killing and Buddhist ethics, I think, are not insignificant. On the one hand, they are part and parcel with a Zen approach to non-duality that had thrived in East Asia for centuries prior. And on the other, only supported the elite image of the early modern samurai as distinct from the rest of society, and I think in an ethical category all their own. So if we return to this image that we began with of Takawan kind of meandering through this warrior epic, I hope his presence here makes more sense to you now. Published more than a century after his death, works like this help to support the image of Takawan offered up by his own hand and in his own letters. He was, I think, very deliberate in his articulation of Zen within a changing social and governmental landscape, and it affected the views of certainly the Shogun Iemitsu, daimyo, and swordsmanship instructors that surrounded him. In illustrated works like this, too, we can see that his contributions as a Zen thinker and writer remained valuable for others who sought to narrativize his legacy and impact among the warrior class. It's precisely through works like these, and I think also through exhibitions and events like these hosted by the NCMA, that we can better understand the social, historical, and philosophical aspects of Buddhist patronage and of Zen more narrowly in 17th century Japan. I'll leave it there, but I will say as a librarian, I'm obligated to give a further reading list. So here are some references if you would like, and if anyone would like these slides, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your talk. Was the militarism of Japan in the 1930s and 40s in any way connected to a samurai mindset or a desire to revive a samurai era in Japan?
I'll tackle that from a broader sort of historical point of view, and then maybe we'll hear something more focusing on religion. You know, Japan embarked on a course of intensive industrialization and modernization in the 1860s that completely transformed society, right? And it had a Western style government, imported texts and practices, and hired thousands of foreign experts to come in and help Japan become powerful in the way that the so-called great powers of the 19th century were powerful. And that involved rejection of the samurai, rejection of many traditional cultural practices. The samurai were forced to give up their stipends, to cut their hair, to dress like, modern, AKA Western men. And they were disappeared, basically. I mean, they really did go away. Eventually, as happens in all cultures, nostalgia emerged, and people became very enamored with a romanticized, mythologized vision of the Tokugawa or earlier periods in Japanese history. And for some, that also meant, I think, a romanticization of the samurai. In my mind, the particular forms of cultural nationalism that emerged in the 1930s were something new. They had elements, recycled elements, nostalgic elements from the past, but they were very new. And one example that I'll use is in one of my areas of study is ceramics. And tea bowls from the pre-modern period became popular again in the 1930s. And the styles that had been, beloved in the 16th century became popular in the 1930s. But they were tweaked. They were adapted to modern sensibilities. And in some cases, they were literally broken and reformed. There were these old tables that they would glue together with lacquer to create new, more striking modern versions of the old. And I think the same thing happened for warrior traditions as well. So to me, it's a reinvented idea of the samurai rather than any kind of authentic notion of samurai spirit that did indeed play a role in Japanese empire.
I'll just add, in the case of Buddhism, this is precisely Brian Victoria's thesis here. He writes a book called Zen at War, which says precisely this, that people like Takuan and others from the early modern period, through their writings, through their sort of ideas, their philosophies, laid the groundwork for what would be very easy interpretations or a kind of Buddhist integration or a kind of non-dual integration into military approaches during that period. So he, I will say, is, to my reading anyway, in the minority on that view. I think it's a little loose, some of the connections that he makes between early modern writings, early modern ideas, and some of the ideas that manifested around the 30s, 40s. But it's worth considering. And I think certainly it's not an absolute case where there was no connection, but I think you might be pressed to make some fairly clear connections there between those two periods.
Hi, thank you. I have to think of how to phrase this. As these shogunates, they developed and evolved over these centuries. And then, of course, the Buddhism and the Zen faith came also into their way of thinking. How did this all meld then with the development of their Bushido, the samurai code of the warrior?
I take a first.
Well, if I could just say very quickly, this is precisely what Takuan is saying, is that in fact these sort of samurai ethics, so to speak, the samurai approach to fighting is really one and the same with a Buddhist worldview. And so I think one not mistake, but a sort of a misreading of Takuan is to think that he was trying to apply Zen Buddhism to Bushido or a kind of a way of the samurai. But I think rather, and maybe more nuanced, he's actually trying to show how they are identical, not an application, but rather sort of showing how they are one and the same. The mind and body, as it's controlled and sort of reined in by the samurai warrior, is precisely the same kind of mechanisms that are playing out in Zen practice at a monastery, at least according to his writings. So integration, right, is an interesting way to put it, but I think, again, from the view of Takuan, it's not an integration, but just simply a kind of putting on display the fact that they are one and the same, right? The sort of ways of thinking.
The other piece of this that I would add is that it's really important to understand that Zen is, and I think Dr. Hayes had a slide that showed this in a technical way, Zen is just one of many religious institutions and faiths in Japan. And it is not by any stretch of the imagination the most important, the most popular, or the most influential. Pure Land Buddhism is far, far more significant in terms of number of followers. Tokugawa Ieyasu patronized Zen institutions on occasion, but he was a Pure Land follower and believer. And many samurai had family connections to one temple, but also worked closely with Zen institutions. So the kind of polytheism, the syncretism of Japanese religion, it is so different from monotheistic cultures where, one faith, one God, this sort of ideology is dominant. You got a little Shinto, you got a little Pure Land, you got a little Zen. It depends on what you need at a particular moment. So there has been, I think, a very modern attempt to make the argument that Japanese culture and Zen are synonymous somehow. And that is a fun thing to debate, but there's very little historical evidence that that claim has any water, in my opinion.
If I could just also add on to that. So non-duality as a concept is not exclusive to Zen, right? It is ubiquitous in East Asian Buddhism, which is a form, what we call Mahayana Buddhism, a larger branch that grew out of the time of the Buddha, but it is not exclusive to Zen. I think the sort of connections that are made between Zen and martial prowess, or samurai ethic, or Bushido, in a large way are related to, again, going back to nostalgia, right? In many ways are related to some of those antinomian acts that were enshrined in text over thousands of years. So cutting cats in half and doing all this sort of really radical, ethically radical stuff that was essentially a kind of spiritual demonstration, made those connections between, martial ethics and Zen much more easier to make, much more than Pure Land Buddhism or Shingon Buddhism or what have you. So there are sort of easy connections, I think, there.
Thanks for the discussion. I wanted to elaborate on the mental aspect that you brought in at the end of the presentation, where you were saying you want to be open mentally, but also don't fixate on anything. And I feel like as a human being, I resonate with that 100%. It's probably one of the hardest things in my life to kind of align with. I was confused on the examples, though, with the extreme examples of the cat, cut in half, or the shoe on the head. Is that just, do you think that's an extreme example, or do they actually think that people who are, I don't want to say this in the wrong way, maybe mentally disturbed, are like more in line with, the Zen Buddhism? Like, I don't understand how that kind of fits together, I guess.
So how some of those antinomian acts are related to the mind, or the nature of the mind. I think there it's the sort of the key to think about, at least again, according to these texts, is the overcalculation or the thinking. So, and it's related to Takuan's stopping, right? So he discusses the stopping of the mind on the sword, stopping of the mind on the enemy, on one's own movements, on one's own sword. Those are moments where you're going to die. You're going to get cut down by the enemy, right? Same thing happens in these dialogical interactions between a master and a student in the Chan or Zen context. In some ways, it is combative. It is an exchange, and in some ways is not a battle, but there is something meant to be elicited from the student by the master. Now, Mahakashyapa, I think, is a great example, because at least according to that story, he does know thinking and he does know stopping. And in some of these other cases where the master prompts the student to show his prowess, show his spiritual understanding, standing up and putting your shoes on the head, it's about as little thinking as you could possibly do in that moment, right? So if you stand up, for example, and begin to recite sutra literature and this commentary and that commentary and give this very eloquent response, you've missed the entire point, right? The entire point is to stop that so that the mind remains open to anything to sort of flow freely through. And those are certainly extreme examples. There are other examples that are maybe less extreme in the Womanguang. One example where there's a master sitting on a high seat. They usually have these sort of elevated seats to show kind of physical status during these dialogical exchanges. And the master, I can't remember the first exchange, the master will say something to the student, and the student will stand up and push him off the seat and sit up there. And then the master will do the same. He'll push the student off and sit up there. And then back and forth, they play this kind of musical chairs, right? And no one says a thing. It's this sort of physical negotiation, so to speak. And in that moment, the student is kind of recognized as understanding what to do, right? Or I guess what not to do in that moment. And that's held up as a kind of an example of religious understanding. Does that help at all? Clarify a little bit? Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you.
Well, so the one thing I'll add is one of the problems is that one of the core tenets, I think, of Zen Buddhism, in my understanding, is that insight can be gained through physical practices, not only discursive, verbalized practices. So talking about a mode of learning and becoming that is nonverbal can sometimes sound like a kind of nonsense. And that's not that it's just made up or that it's, mental illness or something else. Those are particular outcomes of mental processes that are not best expressed in words, I think is probably, is that fair?
Yeah, words are a huge problem for Zen Buddhists. Language,
For us all.
I mean that seriously. So language is a problem because a language is just artifice, right? If I sat here and described what's happening in this room, right? These people are sitting staring at me, I'm delivering a talk using this microphone, rather than just doing it, right? Rather than just being here and letting it kind of unfold, right? That's the kind of distinction that I think Zen Buddhists are trying to make. There's another example that just came to mind. I think it was a well-known poet, kind of a wandering Zen poet named Renyo, who was said to have achieved enlightenment in a boat with his master on Lake Biwa when he gazed up at the moon. That's it. He's sort of sitting, paddling, it was at night with his master, and he looks up, boom, he's just awakened, enlightened right in that moment. So it's unpredictable, it's physical, right? It transcends language, and for these reasons, it can be really annoying to talk about.
But thank you for your question.
Yeah, it's difficult, not annoying, difficult to talk about is what I'm. Yeah.
Thank you both for a really wonderful overview. And I just want to say that the Zen Buddhists produced a lot of words for people who didn't like words that much.
Yes.
So
Great.
there is a little bit of a contradiction there. But I want to shift to the armor question because, Morgan, you mentioned something really interesting about performative samurai in the Pax Tokugawa. And one thing that's really stunning about the armor in the show is how pristine it is. And which leads one to think, one, that it wasn't used in battle, obviously, but also that it might have been used ceremonially or in pageantry or as a costume, which changes the function of it and can make it more aesthetic and less necessary for it to be protective. So one question was, do you think armor changed in a performative pageantry mode to be more demonstrative, more aesthetic in some ways? And also just speaking about Meiji, which repudiated so much of the Tokugawa and everything connected to samurai ethics in the imperial restoration, how did they survive? Would they have been costumes? I know they were used in Yokohama photography studios and other places. How did these travel to us? Was the provenance that they were protected in families, or were they, maybe we're misunderstanding what the legacy of Tokugawa was in Meiji?
Yeah, please. Thank you. That's wonderful comments and questions. In paintings of battles from the 16th century, even paintings that we think are made not long after the conflicts themselves, some of the higher ranking warriors, the commanders, the generals, are wearing these incredible helmets and elaborate, beautiful suits of armor. So I don't think that the highly decorative, performative function of armor was an invention of the Pax Tokugawa culture of war or of the display of warrior material culture. I think it actually did emerge in the Sengoku period, and it probably was a result of the way that in the Age of Warring States, different warlords had a strong sense of independence. They ruled their regime not because they had been given permission to do so by the imperial court or the shogun, but because they had seized power, raised an army themselves, and they were fiercely proud and independent in the sense that they were warlords. And so this culture of display, of striking fear into your enemies through these elaborately commissioned suits of armor, I think came out of Sengoku culture, really. But then it was almost museumified in the Tokugawa period, and it became part of the way that families who no longer could prove their valor on the battlefield displayed their heritage, celebrated their history, and yearned for the good old days when samurai could kill each other in battle through these elaborate displays in these ceremonial halls. So for example, there are versions of the tea ceremony where half the ceremony is a kind of rustic tea gathering, and then the other half is in a display hall where all the swords and armor are out. And those seem to me to conflict. It seems like there's a tension there. But for these wealthy samurai in the Tokugawa period, that made all the sense in the world, I think. The Meiji period question is really interesting. So when the Meiji Restoration happened and there was this repudiation of Tokugawa culture and politics, some samurai families found themselves impoverished because, of course, gradually, even the great warrior houses of Japan had to be sort of weaned off of the stipends that had been their hereditary bread and butter during the Tokugawa period. They had to work for a living, right? And as you know, some became merchants, some became members of the new modern nobility, peers, marquises, things like that. But many sold their collections in the new modern art market to raise funds so that they could try to set up businesses, so they could maintain, their standard of living. And Professor Weisenfeld knows this, but there was a real shift in the art historical study of the Meiji period when scholars started using auction house catalogs from the Meiji period, so from the late 19th century, where you would see this famous samurai family auctioned off this incredible collection of ceramics and painting and sometimes arms and armor as well. But that was an uneven process. Some samurai families figured it out. They transitioned seamlessly into becoming businessmen, or they worked in government, or they kept their status somehow. So some kept their collections, others sold their collections off. And that's why we have incredible collections of art in all kinds of odd places. You'll find samurai arms and armor overseas, all over the world. Really, I think as much because of those Meiji period auctions as because of the collecting that happened during and after the war. So,
And I want to add as well, when you go down in the exhibition and look at the armors, I want you to look closely. What really attracted me to the various items is from that collection in Greensboro, North Carolina, is that it is not highly restored like some other armors. It's very easy to just change out the silk lacing, for example. The metal pieces are lacquered, they're waterproof, they're rust-proof, so it's actually easy to update your armor. So I want you to look closely. The Chinese silk, for example, in parts, it's in tatters. There's dings and scratches. That's part of the life of the armor, even though most of them are from the Edo period and have not seen battle, but they were used, as we discussed, for parades and other official government functions where you have to wear your tuxedo or your armor if you are a samurai. This will be our last answer for today. Thank you so much, Morgan, Matthew,